Shobha Rao is the author of the collection of short stories, An Unrestored Woman. She is the winner of the 2014 Katherine Anne Porter Prize in Fiction, awarded by Nimrod International Journal. She has been a resident at Hedgebrook and is the recipient of the Elizabeth George Foundation Fellowship. Her story, Kavitha and Mustafa, was chosen by T.C. Boyle for inclusion in the Best American Short Stories 2015. She lives in San Francisco. Please welcome Shobha Rao.
We moved to the United States when I was about 7.5 years old. We moved to Virginia. And my dad was there for a one-year fellowship. And at the end of that year, it was time to make a decision, and the decision was this: do we stay in the United States, or do we go back to India? And I'm sure my parents had some late night discussions and talked about the pros and cons. I'm sure they did. They didn't really consult my sister and I. We were both young, except for one day, one afternoon, I'm watching television and my mom's cooking dinner, and she looks up at me and she says, "So what do you think? Do you want to stay, or do you want to go?" And by this time, I'm 8, but I gave it some real thought. I thought, well, I've forgotten all my Hindi, which is India's national language, and which would be the language that most of my classes in India would be taught in. I'd forgotten it. And I had assimilated. I'd assimilated in only the way a child can assimilate. And so after giving it some thought, I said to her, "I want to stay." And we stayed. Probably not for that reason, but we stayed. And we moved around quite a bit in the coming years, and we finally ended up moving to Indiana, central, semi-rural Indiana. The cornfields were right there outside of town. And that is where I started high school. And now this high school had a policy where you could eat lunch on campus or you could leave. We just came back by the time lunch hour ended. And on cold days, in the wintertime, since I didn't have any friends, I would eat my lunch in one of the empty classrooms. But on warm days, sometimes I would go out, I'd wander around, and sometimes I would go to the Burger King, the nearby Burger King, and I'd sit there by myself and I would eat my lunch. One day during my junior year, I'm sitting there, I'm eating my lunch at the Burger King, and these 2 girls walk in. They're my classmates. And these 2 girls, they're the most popular girls in my school. They are absolutely beautiful, especially Jen. Now, Jen is the classic American beauty. She has long blonde hair, she has these gray-green eyes, and she is fully developed. Fully developed. So she was, as you can imagine, really popular with the boys. So Jen and her friend, they look over and they see me sitting alone, and they come over, and Jen says, "Can we sit with you?" And I was so perplexed. No one had asked to sit with me at lunch, and I said, "Sure, go ahead." And so they joined me, and they talk mainly between themselves, but every now and then they would look over at me and they say, "So, what do you think of this teacher?" or "How did you do on this test?" And while they're talking, in the course of this lunch, it dawns on me why they'd ask to sit with me. No, it doesn't actually dawn on me. It hits me like a ton of bricks. The reason they'd ask to join me is because they pitied me. And, well, they felt sorry for me. And there I was, an object of their pity. And I wanted to say to them, please don't. You know, you can feel anything else for me, but please don't feel pity. But I didn't say that, and we ended up, finished the lunch, and we went back. And as we were walking back, I said to myself, Amma, and Amma is the Telugu word for mom. I said, Amma, ask me again. Ask me again if I want to stay or if I want to go. So the years go on, I become an adult, and I move to San Francisco. And a couple of years ago, a friend of mine says, hey, let's go to a baseball game. And I had never been to a baseball game. And she says, you gotta come. It's the San Francisco Giants, and they're playing the Pittsburgh Pirates. And she knew I'd gone to school in Pittsburgh. So she said, oh, it's gonna be great. You gotta wear the gold and the black, which is the Pittsburgh Pirates colors, and we're gonna go to AT&T Park, this huge ballpark, we're gonna go to this game. I said, fine. And then she said to me, and by the time you are done watching this baseball game, you will be an American. I was like, okay. I said, okay, all right. So I wore gold and black, and I show up, and we go into the ballpark. We watch the game, and it was pretty boring. But the garlic fries were really good. And so we watch the game, we walk out of the ballpark, we're walking to the metro stop, and there's a group of young men, and they're drinking, drunk, maybe, and they look over at us, they look over at me. One of the guys looks directly at me, and he says, why don't you just go home? And I looked at him, and then I looked down, and I thought, Amma, ask me again. Ask me again if I want to stay or if I want to go. Thank you.
Thanks, Shobha. Michael Marsolek is a musician and radio personality from Missoula. He is a singer, percussionist, and professional didgeridoo player. He sings with the 24-voice a cappella choir, Dolce Canto. Michael is a founding member of Drum Brothers World Percussion Ensemble and has played professionally in a number of groups for more than 25 years. Every winter you will find him and his musical partner, Lawrence Duncan, on the road with A Musical Dreamtime Journey, celebrating the winter solstice season with candlelight concerts. His voice is familiar to radio listeners across Montana, as by day he is the program director for the Montana Public Radio Network. He has been at his current position since the day after September 11th. He lives with his two younger children in the Rattlesnake. Michael told a story at Tell Us Something a few years ago about his eldest daughter titled The Parenting for Life Plan. The update is that now he's a grandfather. His story tonight is called Going for the One in a Roundabout Kind of Way. Please welcome Michael Marsolek.
That's good. So, I changed my life. I quit my job. I moved 750 miles back to Montana because of a song. What you may not know about me is before I had my career doing music and radio, I worked in the food business. I worked in the food business for 14 years, most of it managing restaurants in 4 states. The last stint was for TGI Fridays. I worked for 2 stores in the desert in Phoenix, I worked in Seattle, and I worked in Portland. The Portland store was the second busiest Fridays on the West Coast. It was incredibly busy and incredibly fun. I was being groomed to get my own store. I was the number 2 guy at the number of these restaurants. And the regional manager had come in and said, do you want to transfer to San Jose? I said, not really, no. And I'm glad I didn't, because the fall of that year, 1989, I would have been in the Bay Area during the earthquake. Well, he said to me, the regional manager said, you know, you're 4 to 6 months away from getting your own restaurant, and you can run one of these things. And that was really exciting. And this place was fun. It was so busy, we'd go on a waiting list at 5 o'clock every night, almost every night, sometimes not on Mondays. We'd go off the waiting list at midnight. The bar would be 3 or 4 people deep all night on all 4 sides. There was a crew of 75 people that I worked with. The waiters and the bartenders were making money hand over fist. This place was doing $90,000 a week. It was busy and fun. Well, I've been a musician my whole life. My brother Matthew and I had our first official band together when I was in 6th grade, and he was in 4th. We've been making music off and on for most of our lives. And for most of my early life, and even now to a certain extent, I was that guy. You know the guy, the great record collection, the kick-ass stereo at home, buys all the albums on the day they come out, goes to lots of really great concerts, and makes mixed tunes tapes for all their family and friends. Right? I was that guy. I went to a lot of different concerts and I worked in a lot of different restaurants. When I was in the food business, a couple stories I don't have time to go into detail on. Like the story when I was chasing the dine and ditch dudes down Montana Avenue with a chili paddle. Or the time when I was helping cook bar rush because the kitchen got completely snowed at this place I was working at, and I went back, I tucked my tie into my shirt, and I'm back there flipping eggs, and the waitress comes up to the window and she says to me, Michael, we need you. The guy on table 45 is asleep in his omelet. And when I went out there and woke him up, he jumped up swinging, just swinging. Or the time when I was down in the Phoenix area and working for this restaurant that had lots of celebrities coming in. The owner was friends with Waylon Jennings. There were lots of musicians that came in a lot. Alice Cooper came in one night with his family. He came up to me and he said, "Are you the manager?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "I just want to have a nice night alone with my family tonight. I don't want to sign autographs. I don't want to be bothered. Can you help with that?" I said, "Well, I can't really keep people from approaching you, but I'll kind of keep an eye on things." Turns out people didn't really recognize him without the makeup. It wasn't really an issue that night. Walter Davis, the incredible shooting guard for the Phoenix Suns, came in one night to a restaurant I worked at in Phoenix and ran this huge tab up for his entire entourage and paid multiple thousands of dollars on an American Express card. Huge tip for the waitress, and then left the credit card at the restaurant. Waitress came up to me and said, "Mr. Marsolek, the Walter Davis left his credit card." I said, "Okay," stuck it in my shirt pocket. About a half an hour later, the phone rings. "It's Walter Davis from the Suns. I think I might have left my credit card there." I said, "Yeah, don't worry, I've got it. It's here in my pocket. If you want to send somebody down, pick it up, or if you want to come back or whatever you want to do." He said, "You got that in your pocket? You can't have that card in your pocket. You need to put that in a safe. That is a platinum American Express card with no limit. You could buy a Mercedes with that card." I really wanted to buy a Mercedes with that card. There was also the time when I was closing the restaurant. I was the last guy. I swear it was one of the busiest days of the entire year. Last one out, locked the doors. I get in my car outside the restaurant. I sit down, and that moment, the guy who's in the back seat of my car jumps up with a knife, holds it to my neck, and says, "Give me the money bag." I said, I don't have the money bag. He said, go get it. I said, okay. I got out of the car, and then I'm walking towards the back of the restaurant, and the other guy came out, the one with the gun, and I was robbed at knife and gunpoint, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, what is the combination? I got to give these guys some money. We'll be fine. It's going to be fine. What did they teach me in management training when I did my management training for this? Give them anything they want and a burger and fries to go. Anyway, back to the music part. I got to go to a lot of concerts, right? I don't have time to tell those stories either. I was at the last Grateful Dead show, July 1995, Soldier Field. I got to see Momentary Lapse of Reason tour, Pink Floyd in the desert in Phoenix, Peter Gabriel at Red Rocks. But I've seen Yes 8 times. I've been a big fan of the band Yes. I think this was at the 2002 tour, actually. It says on the back. I've been a big fan since I was in junior high and discovered the Yes Songs album with my friends. As soon as I realized that here's a band that all 5 musicians are incredibly best of their craft, and they're doing this incredibly complex music, this progressive rock and roll, and the message is so positive and awesome for our world, it just completely worked for me. So needless to say, on June 20th, 1989, when the Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, Howe album came out, it's a Yes album, it's complicated, trust me. When that album came out, I did what we do in those days. I got off work at Fridays, I went and I bought the album at a record store, right? I went home and I was going to listen to the record. For those of you young people in the audience, we actually used to listen to the music top to bottom, front to back, the entire work of art, while holding the liner notes, while looking at the album artwork, while experiencing it with headphones. Things are a bit different now. I did that. I went home to my apartment in Portland, and I bought the Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, Howe album, and I listened to it. And here is the actual lyrics, the word for word, what I heard that day, and what was into my brain, word for word. Not all of it, but quite a bit of it. So, giving all the love you have, never be afraid to show your heart. Someone told me, there are brothers, live forever in the big sky. Just hear your voice, sing all the songs of the world. Nothing can come between us, you're a brother of mine. Long lost brother of mine, seeing my life for the first time. Long lost brother of mine, living my life in the big dream. Long lost brother of mine, watching me walk in the full moon. And long lost brother of mine, redefining this long lost passion for the living we're in. This will be the first of many. I could not believe it. John Anderson had written a song for me. The next day, not 2 days, the next day, I walked in and I gave notice at TGI Fridays in Portland. A couple weeks later, I worked my last shift in a restaurant, and I'm happy to say that in the last 4 or 5 years, I finally have gotten far enough from working all those years in the food business that I'm experiencing going out to eat in a different way. I'm not like the food critic analyzing the waiter, watching how they plate the food and the garnishing and all that, right? It's very different for me now. Here's what happened in the next 2 months. I moved back to Montana. My brother Matthew and Patrick and I formed a trio and began to perform professionally as the Marsolek Brothers Trio. A little while later, we were sitting around a table in Clinton, Montana, trying to figure out what to call ourselves and the instruments that we had handcrafted as we were on our way to the UC Art Fair at the University of Montana. 3 brothers making drums. 3 brothers making drums. Drum Brothers has been making drums now for 25 years or more, and 7,500 drums later, my dad and my sister-in-law still are building instruments. The Drum Brothers band was formed a few years later, and my brother Matthew and my musical brothers are playing music to this day. We started the Full Moon Drummings, which went on in Missoula for a quarter of a century here in town. Yeah. And Finally, 27 years ago this week, I went down to KUFM and I had my first training shift with the late John Myers. And I learned how to use my voice to do radio too. And for the first shows that I did solo, and for actually a number of years after that on those late night shifts, I played a lot of my favorite rock and roll. Yes, and Kansas, and Styx, and Supertramp, and Rush, and Van Halen, and Iron Butterfly. Yes, I was the guy that was playing Inagata Davida in the middle of the night, 89, 90, 91. I still get to make mixed tunes tapes every Tuesday at 11 o'clock for Montana on the radio, on Montana Public Radio. I've been doing it ever since. Our pledge drive's coming up in 3 weeks. Call 800-325-1565 or 243-6400 to pledge your support. There are brothers. Live forever in the big sky, he said. And I will. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Becca Kelly grew up in the countryside of eastern Pennsylvania. She ended up unexpectedly settling down in Missoula a few years back. In her late teens and 20s, she traveled a fair amount and discovered a love for foreign language. She is still figuring out what to do with that in Missoula. Meanwhile, she spends her time either with her 3-year-old son or focusing on the things she loves to do, practicing yoga, making jewelry, singing and playing guitar, and getting outside in this beautiful place where we live. Please welcome Becca Kelly.
Can y'all hear me out there? Oh, this is great. I can't see anything. Except for Frankie. So my story takes place here in Missoula. It happened in 2002, not so long ago. I was at the time a student at the University of Montana. I had a double major, German and Russian, and on this particular day that I'm going to tell you about was the last day of my second to last semester at the University of Montana. And it was the evening, it was around 7:30, and I was sitting in my little kitchen, which was on Front Street, across the street from the Rhino, right above the Angler store. You hear the Rhino like every night. I like to think just Saturdays and Sundays, but it was really every night. Fridays and Saturdays. Anyway, so it's been a crazy semester, and I'm having dinner with my friend Jen. She was also studying German and Russian, so she was my only friend of this kind at the university. And we were celebrating because it had been a crazy semester, and you know, it's 7:30, it's the last week of classes, the last day. And we're just sitting down to eat. So I'm gonna backtrack just a little bit and give you a little more background. So I, at the time, had one more semester before I finished my double German and Russian degree. And I had done all my German credits, and I only had to finish my Russian credits, and I had 4 classes of upper division Russian that I needed to take, which seemed like a breeze compared to how hard I had been working before that. And I knew that I would go to Russia and study Russian because that's what I did with German. I studied a lot of German, and then I spent 1.5 years of my first 3 years in college where they speak German, because that's what you should do when you're studying German. And then the other 2 people I would like to tell you about was the Russian faculty at this time at the University of Montana. And I say 2 people because there were only 2 professors. And I'm going to describe each of them in detail. So first, there was Marina Kanievskaya, and she was this petite little woman who was the Russian faculty for me at the time. People would gather in her office after class and talk about Russian things, and it's really fun, It's exciting. Well, she made it exciting because she was so cool, and she was such a little bird, she would see you and say, Becca, как дела? Здравствуй, ну, как дела? And, just like this, and you'd be like, oh, hi, Marina, how are you? One time I walked by her office, and I heard her telling another student, Rebecca, she's like a sponge. Stuff like that, little things. And then the other professor, to juxtapose the two professors, her name was Ludmilla, and I say it like that because can you imagine a better name for like the evil character in the story? It's like Ludmilla. And Ludmilla looked like, she slept in a case that covered her hair because it never changed the style ever. And she always wore the same shirt that buttoned up to her neck and a skirt that came to here or here. And when she walked, oh, there's the Russian professor coming to class. Oh boy, And she was a terrible professor, if you can imagine from that description. I specifically went to her office one time because, you guys aren't going to believe this, because I wanted her to please speak a little more Russian to her students so that we could learn the Russian language through hearing it, because we were studying it. She had her own class materials that she thought was really great, and she would read sentence by sentence her class materials at the front of class, like, she was reading the military roll call, and otherwise not speak any Russian. So I went to her office and said, please speak more Russian, and she said, Becca, American students can't learn Russian. It's too difficult for them. I'm not kidding. Needless to say, this angered me, and I kind of hated her guts. So anyway, we're going to come back to having dinner with my friend. We're celebrating. This is a great night, hooray. And the phone rang, thinking, okay, it's 7:30 or so. Before I tell you what the phone call was, I'm going to give you a little more background. So you all know this intersection in town. When you go down 6th Street and you're going one way toward Mount Sentinel, and the road comes to Arthur, there's an intersection there, and then you go another block, and you can either go to the Adams Center, or you can turn left and go over the Van Buren Bridge. So maybe a lot of you know, maybe some of you know, but I know you've all driven along this bit of Missoula. The traffic patterns used to be different, like yesterday in 2002. And you couldn't make a left onto Arthur there from 6th. You had to go straight down and then curve around and go up over the Van Buren Bridge. So there was quite a lot more traffic going around that curve, right by the Adams Center. Y'all know where I'm talking about. I'm just going to assume that. So Friday night, just sitting down to eat with my friend, babbling about the semester and the party that we're going to go to. We had like a masquerade party to go to with our crazy Dutch friends. The phone rings. Jennifer answers her phone, so excited, and her face just, boom, just dropped. And I thought, oh, what's going on? So, and maybe some of you remember this happening, I don't know. At about 7 p.m. that night, little Marina Kanievskaya was finishing her day of work at the end of a long semester. She crossed 6th right at the curve there where it goes around to go up and over the bridge, and a truck came around the curve and hit her. And she was lying in the road, and she was actually still alive from the story that I was told. And the man who was driving the truck apparently got out and inspected his truck and decided it wasn't damaged too badly and got back in it and drove away and left her there. And another car couldn't see her because it was dark out and came around the curve and ran her over. So that was the call that we got that night at 7:30 p.m. And you know, what do you do when you when you get a phone call like that? It was just so absurd. We couldn't really process it all, so I was just talking to Jen recently about this, and she was like, yeah, Becca, don't you remember? We went to the masquerade party, and we drank tons of vodka. I was like, no, that's probably why I don't remember. And then you could walk across the train tracks at that time, and then she ran outside and ran across the railroad tracks at the end of the night and like slept and tried to go stay on the railroad tracks and wouldn't leave. It was so dramatic. It's like, that's why they put the pedestrian bridge up, you know, all kinds of forks in the road for people. Anyway, that was a huge fork in the road for me, because I'll tell you that the short version of the story is that after we had kind of digested what happened, I said to myself, my God, couldn't they have gotten the other professor? You know, like, sounds terrible, but really the Russian fact department just disappeared. And for me, at least, I went to the first day of class. The next semester, being very brave, I went to Ludmila's class, and I had drafted a letter to her to say, please, you know, if you want to teach your students Russian, please speak Russian to them and use maybe some Russian language materials in your class. And all the Russian students signed it, or at least most of them did. And she walked in on the first day of class with big stacks of, like a big stack of paper like that big, and just threw it on everybody's desk like boom, boom. Here's your desire for an education, you sleazy little students, you know. At least that's what I felt. And then she said, from here on, since everyone here wants to speak Russian in class and read Russian, we're only going to do that. And everybody looked like, oh my God, you know, these are like 18th century texts. How are we supposed to do this? So needless to say, I walked out and never went back. And then ended up getting a Russian studies minor and a Russian minor. And it changed the course of my life, really, because if I had studied Russian, I would have gone to Russia. I know I would have. And instead, I finished school. And what do you do with a major in German and minors in Russian and Russian studies? I went to South Korea. Thought I would teach English. That didn't work out either. You know, I ended up getting into some interesting work in South Korea because I needed income. I did voiceover and worked for film, and towards the end of my stay started playing guitar, and you know, never know where life leads you. I think every moment is a fork in the road, really. But you know, and now I'm in Missoula again. I never expected it, and every time I go around that intersection, I think of her. And recently I had the most this kind of odd experience going around that intersection and realizing not only that I'm back in Missoula, but that I wouldn't have been here. I don't think I ever would have been here if it hadn't been for Marina. I don't think I ever would have come back. So that's the kind of fork in the road that you don't know is a fork in the road until much, much later in time. And now it's a fork in the road for everybody because nobody can go down 6. You know, now you have to turn there, right? All right, thanks, guys.
Thanks, Becca. Having lived in a teepee at the base of the 14,000-foot Southern Rockies, Tommy Peterson moved to Missoula and the Northern Rockies 25 years ago to continue mountain life, getting his graduate degree in environmental studies at the University of Montana. He is the editor of the conservation anthology, A Road Runs Through It, with a foreword by Annie Pralks, and on writing breaks plays soccer with the old boys at the Peace Farm soccer field. Please welcome Tommy Peterson.
This is called Going Postal and is for Brian. At age 60, I lost my job of 17 years as development director of a small nonprofit here in Missoula. I knew it was coming. Our organization, it was a time when the recession was happening. Our organization was struggling a little bit, even though it was a great organization. We had to merge with a larger one in order to survive. And my executive director told me about it some months ahead of time, so I was kind of prepared. But they had a larger development department, fundraising department, and I wasn't a part of that merger. So after 17 years, I was without a job here in Missoula, which is a tough kind of thing. But after 17 years, it was kind of nice to take a break and just enjoy this beautiful town that we're in, at least for a few weeks, because you can't be here very long without work. So I figured, who likes to raise money? Nobody. So there's a lot of development director positions out there, and I'd been doing it a long time. And sure enough, there was one that I saw kind of right away there a couple weeks later. Put in my resume and cover letter, and got the first interview. That went great. Got the second interview. Oh, this is good, this is good. Got a phone call, then now it's a few weeks later, because this takes a little while to happen, and it was, you came in second. Okay, all right, no worries. Again, a lot of nonprofits here in Missoula, a lot of development directors, so a lot of positions. And sure enough, I saw a second position sort of crop up, applied for that one. Put in my resume, cover letter, got the first interview, went great. Got the second interview with the executive director and a couple of staff people, and we got along famously. And in fact, that one, there was sort of a scheduling snafu, and the other person, because I said that I knew at the time there was just two of us at that time that were for the position. The other person was a younger woman, about 35, well-dressed woman. So that was interesting to kind of see that was my competitor. But I thought the second interview went really well, and got the phone call, you were runner-up. Okay, took a deep breath, and I'm kind of a sports guy. As Mark said, I played a little soccer and played baseball and blah, blah, and I figure, okay, I'm 0 for 2. And in baseball, that's not too bad. And these weren't strikeouts. These were like fly balls, maybe at the warning track even. So I was hanging in there. And so I kind of figure I can do this again. And I do. And I see a third position. And third time's a charm, right? So I apply and put in my resume and my cover letter. In case you haven't applied for a job in a while, this takes a while for these things to happen. It's not like a quick phone call. After you turn in things, and it takes a couple of weeks, and then you get the first interview. And then if you're lucky enough to get the second interview, that's a few more weeks. And then there's the phone call. So by this time, it had been 4 or 5 months I'd been without work. So I was really kind of counting on this one. And with that second interview with this position, I was in front of the whole board of directors. And I was feeling pretty good. And they were asking me good questions. I felt like I was giving good answers, and so left feeling pretty confident. So a couple weeks later, I get a message to give that organization a call. And I remember I was sitting in my car in a parking lot at Rose Hours, of all places, and I was parked, and I take a deep breath and I call them back. And they say, Tommy, we really loved your energy. We really, really loved it. And we had a vote with our board, and it was 4-3, and you didn't get the position. I wasn't smiling then. I remember I took the keys and threw them against the dash of the car. I was just enraged. And I was like calling that organization every name in the book. I had hung up the phone at this point. You can imagine, right? This is third time and out, and second place, 4-3, shit. So I'm driving home, and I'm just pissed. And I get home, and my anger, I meet my wife at the door, and my anger turns into just tears, It's just like, oh, baby. Yeah, So, but I have a plan B. All along, I kind of had a plan B. And that was the post office. I had seen in the paper somewhere, Craigslist, I think, actually, an ad for a rural postal carrier. And I figured, what the hell, It's not my, area of experience, but I need work, I live in Missoula, Montana. So I applied. And so during all that time when I was applying for all those jobs, I was also applying for the post office. And that means the post office, being a government position, you take a lot of tests. You take a test, for instance, to see basically if you're dyslexic or not. Because a mailbox with the number 7233 is very different than 2733. And you better know the difference between that. So it turns out I'm not dyslexic, so that's good. You take drug tests, you take customer service tests, right? What do you do if a customer says, fuck you? You say, have a nice day, So lo and behold, I get a call from the postmaster of Missoula Post Office, come into my office, I want to interview you. After all these tests, right? Okay. And I sit down in his office and he said, I want to offer you the job. It's like, seriously? And there it is. There's the split for me. There's the fork for me. It's like, do I continue to literally beat my head up against the wall with these development work? This is what I've done pretty much all my life. Or do I take a job that's offered to me? Here it is. So I went postal. So the post office it's a steep learning curve, and they hired me right at the holidays. Really, my first day on the job was the day after Thanksgiving. Busiest mail day of the year. I was out there late with a headlamp and stuff. I really was. But it's a steep learning curve. But once you get it, you kind of got under your belt. So it's winter time, right after the holidays, and I'm doing my route, and I'm driving one of those post office white, boxy kind of vehicles, right-hand side, driving. Windows always down because you're delivering mail out this way. And as I'm going up the street, I see someone stand at the mailbox, which isn't all that unusual. Some people meet you at the mailbox. But as I get closer, I realize, oh, wait a minute, this guy looks familiar. And as I pull up, it's Brian. And I realize, Brian, oh yeah, Brian is a guy that's developmentally disabled and lived in a group home, and about 20 years ago or so, my family took them meals, and we would take all these guys a dinner meal, and we'd sit down and have dinner with these guys. It's like, this is Brian. And as I pull up, I stop and say, Brian, right? That's Brian. And he instantly recognizes me. Tommy, I know you. Tommy, how long have we known each other? Well, I don't know, 22 years, Brian. 22 years, that's a long time. It is a long time, Brian. That's fabulous. And Brian goes on to tell me about a little bit of his life. He was working at the Top Hat, actually, washing dishes. And he said, well, yeah, like Tommy, I cut my hand. And Brian's a big guy. He's like 200 pounds. He's broad-chested. So he's got these big hands, and he puts his big hand and his swollen finger that he cut in my smaller hand. So to show me. Oh, that's awful, Brian. Wow, but it looks like it's healing pretty good. Yeah, it's okay. It's all right. It's all right. So Tommy, how long have we known each other? Well, It's about 22 years, but that's a long time. It is, Brian. And we chat a few more minutes, and it's like, Brian, I gotta go. I gotta deliver mail. So we say goodbye. The next week, there's Brian at the mailbox. I stop. Tommy, it's so good to see you. Tommy, how long have we known each other? Well, about 22 years or so, Brian. That's a long time, 22 years. Yeah, it is, Brian. And he starts to polish my outside mirror because he sees something on there, and then he stops and looks, and he polishes it some more. And he says, well, hey, Tommy, can you get me one of those lanyards that you have on me? Because I have my ID tag in on those little plastic sleeves. Can you get me one of those? I said, well, I can't get you the ID tag. He said, no, just the little plastic thing. I said, yeah, sure, I'll do that, sure, absolutely. So week after week, Brian would meet me at the mailbox, and we would chat. And we would change stories like that. So this went on for months, and so now it's summertime. And I pull up to the mailbox. Brian, Tommy, how are you? Tommy, how long have we known each other? I said, well, it's 22 years, but that's a long time, Tommy. Hey, Tommy, you know what? What, Brian? I'm going to Graceland. You mean like Elvis Presley Graceland? Yeah, I'm going to Graceland. I'm going with my wife. I didn't know Brian was married, you know. Yeah, we're going on the plane, and I get to hold her hand. I said, oh, that is fabulous, Brian. Yeah, we're going to be there for a while, and when we fly back, I get to hold her hand again. And at that point, the tears are welling up. And I was like, Brian, I got to go. And I don't let him do the 22-year thing. I just pull away because I'm starting to cry. And I pull over to the side, and I realize I'm sort of now kind of one of those times where you're sort of laughing and crying at the same time, because I realize that this is part of what this fork has given me. That is that I am so fortunate that I get to witness that kind of sweetness, that I get to witness that kind of love of holding someone's hand. You know, that I've gotten to witness Brian. It's a lucky me. So fast forward about 6 months. And still doing my route, but they changed the day of my route from a Saturday to a Wednesday. And for the past couple months, I hadn't seen Brian, because I figured he had to work on that Wednesday. He maybe had Saturdays off. So when I pull up, though, I kind of slow down at his mailbox. I don't see him there, but I slow down. I kind of crane my neck and look over to see if he's maybe coming out, maybe he's a little late. But he hasn't come out. I haven't seen him for a while, and I miss him. Because, you know, it's been like 23 years now. And that's a long time. Thank you.
Thanks, Tommy. Here's to Brian. Big thanks to all of you all who come out to tell us something every time. Thanks to the newcomers. Thanks for coming out to celebrate each other's stories and give us your ears. After living in Polson for 7 years before moving on, Allison Cox still considers Montana a place she calls home. Allison has been telling stories to anyone who will listen since she could talk. She even started calling herself a storyteller back in 1982. She's been traveling and sharing her stories ever since. She combined her years in public health with her love of story to edit and contribute to 2 books, The Healing Heart for Families, Storytelling to Encourage Caring and Healthy Families, and The Healing Heart for Communities, Storytelling for Strong and Healthy Communities. I need to read that book. She was a founder of the Healing Story Alliance and edits their online journal. Allison lives with her 4-legged and 2-legged family on Vashon Island in Washington State, surrounded by gardens, woods, and water, Please welcome Allison Cox.
Yeah. Hello, Montana. It's good to be back. Well, it was 1970, and we were driving along the road from Mexico City out to the pyramids, when up ahead we saw a girl waving at us and holding up a clay statue. And so Adrian pulled his VW bug over to the side of the road and got out, and just moments later he got back in and handed the statue to me. Is it authentic? He just shrugged. Well, then why did you buy it? He just smiled at me and turned the key in the car, and as he started to pull away, Patty and I turned and looked, and we saw that child, still covered with dust from the road, couldn't have been more than 10 years old, running to a shack that was set way back off the road and waving the money in her hand. And Patty leaned forward from the back seat and patted Adriana on the shoulder, and she said, "You're our Mexican mensch." And he truly was. Patty and I had just finished our junior year in high school, where we had met Renee, an exchange student. And she had invited us to come to visit in Mexico, but when we got there, she was too busy to be our tour guide. And so Adrian had volunteered to take her place, her 20-year-old brother, but he said, "You're gonna have to do your homework," which meant that he would give us pamphlets the night before. He would take us the next day to the museum, the cathedral, the National Palace, the ballet. We loved it. Then he said, "We're going on a road trip. We're gonna see 2,000-year-old pyramids, and then we're going to stay with a family that I know, family home, in Acapulco." The only word I heard in that whole sentence was Acapulco. That morning, July in Mexico, out among the pyramids, it was already so hot, I was feeling woozy. So we walked around for a while till we decided, well, we'll climb the smallest of the big pyramids. It was the most decayed, but it was the shortest climb. But when I got up there, oh, there was this delicious breeze. And so I stood at the summit with my toes right at the edge, and there was a mountain in the distance that just seemed to call to me. So I put out my arms, like I used to do when I was a kid and I'd pretend to fly. And I imagined I was flying to that summit, to that mountain in the distance, and the ground was passing quickly beneath me as I was going faster and higher. And in my mind's eye, I turned and looked to the side, and there, where my arm should have been, was this massive wing, vast in length and completely covered with feathers. And then I heard someone shout my name, and I was pulled backwards by my shirt, and I stumbled into Adrian, and he said, "Whoa there, you were leaning out so far, you were about to become a squash tourist." And I must have looked disoriented because he and Patty walked me down to the bottom of the pyramid, and I said, "Well, what is this place?" And he said, "Well, this is the pyramid of Quetzalcoatl." And I said, "What does that mean?" And he said, he was the feathered serpent, the lord of death and rebirth. And immediately I flashed on that giant wing covered with feathers, and it totally freaked me out. So I just crawled into the back of the Volkswagen, and I kept my mouth shut and just held onto that loop, that they had on the side, as he went from one hairpin turn to the next, all the way through the hill country down to the coast. When we got to Acapulco, it was sunset, and this family home was a villa. It was perched on top of a rock cliff, and there were stone steps that wound down to the sea. Inside the compound, there was an entire orchard of tropical fruit trees that we could pick our breakfast from. And our only chaperone was a sweet-faced woman named Maria, who was always barefoot. And her son, Jaime, was the groundskeeper, but he was the same age as Adrian. So the four of us played the entire time. We went to the highlight game, we saw the cliff divers, we ate shaved ice with mango syrup, and we went swimming every day. One day, a tour boat came drifting near our dock, and it sputtered something in staccato Spanish that cracked up all my friends sitting on the dock. What? I called from where I'm floating in the inner tube. And Jaime said, they just said that this is the summer home of Jackie Onassis and that all of us are visiting Olympic swimmers. I smiled and waved. Well, the next day, the guys took us windsurfing. And so I had on long sleeves and long pants, and I burned my feet. It looked like I was wearing red socks, and then they began to swell, and I started to cry because that was our only Saturday night to go dancing in the Acapulco discos like we planned. And Adrian said, it's all right. The best show will be right here tonight, you'll see. So that night after dinner, he walked us out onto the open-air stone balcony, and he pointed out how there was a bioluminescence that edged each wave with a neon light as it lapped onto the shore. Off in the distance, there was a curtain of lightning that laced down to the sea. But above us, the sky was clear and there was a cacophony of stars. And then Adrian picked up one of the conch shells that was laying along the balcony wall, and he showed me how there was a hole drilled in the top, and then he blew what sounded like a foghorn, long and deep, and resonated across the bay. And then moments later, from all sides, conch shells trumpeted in response. It was magical. Well, I stayed up way late that night talking to Adrian, and I finally told him about my experience on top of the pyramid. I said, don't you think it's strange that I was standing up there imagining that I'm like some giant dragon-sized creature covered with feathers and I'm standing on the feathered serpent's pyramid? Adrian said, well, maybe you read something in the booklet the night before and you forgot about it. I said, Adrian, I was so excited about going to Acapulco, I read nothing about the pyramids. He said, well, maybe it was heat stroke. I don't know. Allison, it just seems like a coincidence to me. You know, I'm a confirmed atheist. I said, atheist? Adrian, how can you not believe in God when you have all this? And I gestured to the sea and the sky and the luminous waves. He said, well, I love nature, but that doesn't convince me there's a deity behind it. And then 16-year-old me said, there is a God, and there is life after death, and on and on and on. Well, the nuns back at Catholic school would have been shocked because I usually argued with them in religion class. But Adrian didn't argue. He just listened, he stated what he believed, and we talked on late into the night. Well, not long after that, it was time to fly home. But I was changed. My world had expanded exponentially. And so Adrian, we stayed in touch through letters. Remember letters? Yeah. He'd write me multiple page letters and he'd send me books like Bertrand Russell's Why I'm Not a Christian. I didn't read it. And then I'd save art cards for him and I'd send him with books like The Little Prince, and I'd underline, it is only with the heart that one can see rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eye. And then he went off to study submarine engineering in Norway. Whew. And I went off to college. And the letters became more scarce as our pathways diverged. I remember I stayed up really late the night before the call came. And so that morning I was dreaming that I was in bed, in my bedroom, except that everything was white. And I realized it was because the room was filled with light. And out of that light came floating Adrian. And he hovered in the air right next to my head where I was sitting up in my bed. And I said, Adrian, what are you doing here? And he said, I just came to tell you, you were right. And then he floated back into the light, and I was calling after him, but I started to hear this ringing, this incessant ringing. And then I realized I was asleep. And so I struggled to wake up and stumbled into the kitchen and answered the phone, and it was my mother. She said that Renee had just called from Mexico and that Adrian had died of a heart attack. He was only 24 years old and just about to get his engineering degree. But it turned out he had a weak heart that he never talked about. Well, I was stunned. So I hung up the phone after I thanked my mom. Now, looking back at all this, now from the other side of the bell curve of life, I really am much less certain about what it is I believe in now, because I find that I can collect all kinds of proofs for pro and con, but it doesn't matter because they're all overrun by my overwhelming desire of what it is I want to believe. And so I can't tell you what any of this means about the nature of reality or immortality, but I can tell you this, that whenever I think about this story, my heart leads, and it leaps right over those big questions and goes first and foremost to this, that what I want to believe is that when I came this time to that great fork in the road that separates me from the people I love, that just this once, Adrienne stopped by to say goodbye. That's my reality, and I'm sticking to it.